Hi, and welcome to Season 5, the final season for our course. I'm going to, in this introductory lecture, cover a whole bunch of different themes. There's not that much unity this lecture. What I want to do is go over what I see as the main themes for the season. And then in the next lecture, I'm going to do a deep dive into Free Churro, the eulogy episode. Okay, but for now, what I want to do is go through basically 4 themes that I see as recurring throughout season 5, and then make a couple points about the season before we move on. All right, first, this is a very difficult season to watch, and one reason is because I think that one of the main themes is that of unrecoverable loss, or loss without closure. If you think about it, and Bojack says this explicitly at a couple points during the season, on most TV shows and in most movies and most novels, whenever there's loss, the loss ends up with some sort of note or hope of redemption or some kind of moral or closure or something that ties the whole story together. Loss usually is not simply loss. Loss leads to some sort of new opening or some sort of understanding or an end to a narrative or something like that. But in season 5, we get loss without closure or without any redemption to it. It's just plain loss. The most obvious example of this is Bojack's mom, who dies, and we're going to talk about this a lot, right? But Bojack's mom dies, and there's no way in which her death finishes her story or gives any redemption to the relationship she has with Bojack or makes any sense out of anything. It's just a death. It's just an end that's never going to come to anything. Another less tragic example that we see here is Mr. Peanut Butter and Diane's relationship, right? That relationship has already ended, but in this season, we see it end without any kind of neat closure. So they have a couple of oopsies where they sleep together after they've already broken up. They're still sort of entangled in one another's lives, but Mr. Peanut Butter is hoping that this is going to lead to kind of a grand reconciliation, and it's part of their story arc of how they're getting back together. But it's not, right? It's just messy. It's just an end that is a mess that doesn't come to anything. And finally, there is Bojack's strangling of Gina. We will have to see in season 6 what comes of that. But for now, at least, as far as season 5 goes, it really seems like there's just nothing that Bojack can do to fix that or make it right. There's no kind of apology that he could give her that would fix it. There's no sort of meaning or reconciliation that he can find there. He tries various things. He thinks that, maybe telling the world his story will help, but it won't. He thinks that maybe getting sober will help. And even though that's obviously a good idea, and it's how the season ends with him trying to get sober, it's not going to fix what happened to Gina. Right? So it's just loss. And so I think one thing that this season asks us to think about, which is difficult, is how do we cope with or make sense of losses that don't come to anything, that don't make any grander sense beyond themselves or give us anything to hold on to. The second theme is the theme of recognition, and I will cycle back to this quite a bit. Right? And we've talked about this a little bit in past seasons, but I think it really gets sharpened here. All of us, the show suggests, want others to recognize us. That is, we want others to see us, really see us, as who we think we are. We want our own sense of ourself to be given uptake in how other people recognize us. Why? Because other people's recognition helps give reality to our identity, as we've discussed, right? Especially so for Bojack. We've talked about this a lot. Bojack particularly lives through the recognition of others. But for everybody, having other people give uptake to who we are and recognize who we are helps them hold us in our identity, hold us in personhood. Remember, we talked about this in season 4. It helps us be who we are by sustaining us in our identity, allowing us to be ourselves by participating and collaborating with us in the activities that make us ourselves. So in this season, we see all kinds of people trying to get recognition, but we see that usually failing. We see a ton of misrecognition. There's, in fact, a bunch of misrecognition going on in 2 senses. One is just straightforward people misrecognizing other people and getting them wrong, seeing them as somebody other than who they actually are. The best example of this is probably when Diane goes back to Vietnam and people there see her as a local Vietnamese person. And she is ancestrally Vietnamese, but in fact, she feels very alien in this environment. And it's not her environment at all, but she is misrecognized repeatedly as a local Vietnamese person. The sex robot is another funny example, right? The sex robot is consistently misrecognized as a powerful executive. No matter how absurd what he says is, people insist on recognizing him as something other than who he is or who it is. Towards the end of the season, Bojack consistently misrecognizes other people as plotting against him and as conspiring and as having all sorts of evil intentions that they don't have. So why does all this misrecognition happen, right? Why are we so bad at recognizing other people? Well, the reason people want recognition is that they want people to really attend to them and respond to them as who they are. But at the same time, the show suggests these very same people are often not attending or really looking. People talk to others and feel like they're really connecting, but instead of actually attending to who they're talking to and responding to who they're talking to, they're basically just projecting a fantasy of who they're talking to onto their audience. So they're really talking to a fantasy version of their audience rather than seeing and recognizing the other person they're talking to. Again, going back to the examples I just gave, this is really clear. People project their fantasies onto the sex robot and see him as saying and doing things that he's not saying and doing. And the American chicken in the Vietnamese episode is clearly projecting his fantasies of what an exotic, innocent Vietnamese girl would be like onto Diane and simply seeing his own fantasies on her. The eulogy episode is great for this also. And again, we'll get back to this in detail too, but Bojack gets through that whole heartfelt, intense eulogy without once noticing that he's actually talking to a room full of geckos he's never met. He never stops to actually see who he's talking to at the same time as he's giving this speech about the importance of being seen and his mom supposedly saying, "I see you." He doesn't see who's around him. He never stops to check, just like he never stops to check who's in the casket. He assumes it's his mother, but it isn't. So on the one hand, we desperately need recognition in order to be held in personhood. And on the other hand, we tend to be bad at giving it because we project our fantasies of who we want to be talking to and how we want to be seen and how we want to be connected onto others rather than really attending to them. So that's the second theme. The third theme is a return more powerfully than ever, even though we've seen this throughout the entire series, to issues around addiction, responsibility, and free will. In this season, Bojack develops a full-on opioid addiction. And there's really important and difficult ethical and metaphysical questions around what that means in terms of his responsibility for his actions. We can ask this at three levels. We can ask, is he responsible for getting addicted in the first place? Once he's addicted, is he responsible for the things that he does in order to get more drugs? And at the third level, once he has the drugs and he's high and disconnected from reality, is he responsible for the things that he does while he's under the influence of the drugs? So I think there's an interesting and difficult responsibility questions at all three of those levels. Right? Is it his fault he got addicted? Well, in some sense, yes, of course. In another sense, he really did fall and hurt his back and really did need the drugs at first. And he really did get a prescription for them. Right? So should we blame, in part, the medical system for overprescribing opiates and not following up and not noticing that here was a patient who was developing a problem? Right? Is it partly his doctors and nurses' fault or the medical system at large? Should we blame Princess Caroline, who let him do the stunt in the first place, as he tries to at one point? And then again, once he's addicted, right, once you're addicted, almost by definition, you lose control of your ability to not use the substance that you're addicted to. That's kind of what addiction is. So once you're addicted, there's really difficult second order questions about whether you can be responsible for continuing to use the drug and for doing things in order to get the drug. Right? So if you think about the episode with Hollyhock where he wastes her whole visit trying to get more drugs and he just behaves horribly. In some sense, of course, we want to hold him responsible for that and say that he did not act well. In another sense, by that point, he is addicted to the opioids. And so we might want to say to some extent, he can't help the fact that he will do anything to get a hold of the drugs. And then finally, the third order, right? Are you responsible for the things that you do while you're high on drugs if you're addicted to those drugs? In this episode, in this season rather, we see him do pretty much the worst thing we've ever seen him do while he's high, namely the strangling of Gina. And of course, we want to hold him responsible for that strangling. He needs to be held to account for it somehow. But it's not clear how to think about the fact that while he did it, he didn't know who or where he was or who she was. He was completely disconnected from reality because of the drug. And again, arguably, we might think he wasn't entirely responsible for being on the drug at that point, since by that time he was already addicted to it. So it seems like we need a more nuanced alternative. We can't just say, well, there are some times where people have free will and they act freely, and so they're responsible for everything they do. And then there are other times where people's actions are determined and they have no free will, and so they're not responsible. Addiction is a complicated case, which is neither of those, right? People are not acting fully freely and responsibly when it comes to addiction, but they're also not just deterministic machines who we want to let off the hook and say that they have no moral responsibility whatsoever. So somehow or other, we need to be able to find a position here where we can say that there are serious limits to what we're able to do and control, that we're not fully in control of our actions, that we don't just simply choose out of the blue voluntarily to become addicted and to do things while we're addicted. And yet at the same time, even though our actions are partly out of our control and partly controlled by our circumstances, we still have to be able and willing to be accountable for the harm that we do. To put it the way that a lot of philosophers do, we need to make room in our understanding of free will and responsibility for moral luck. Moral luck means that you sometimes are morally responsible for an action even though you didn't fully choose it and didn't fully control it, because you had the bad luck or the good luck to do something harmful or helpful, even though you weren't fully in control. Right? So moral luck is the notion that our moral assessments of people and our willingness to hold people morally accountable for things can't be only about the things that they fully and voluntaristically chose. To some extent, you're responsible for your own luck, and if you're unlucky enough to become addicted and you do bad things in order to get more drugs or while you're high, then yes, you were not fully in control. You had some bad moral luck, but you are also accountable for what you did, even though you did it partly because of that bad luck, right? Maybe not accountable in the same way as somebody who fully voluntarily chose their action, and we need to figure out what kind of accountability that is. And conversely, you can have good moral luck too. We see this in the episode where Mr. Peanut Butter is trying to get a tough image and he keeps accidentally helping people. He doesn't mean to, but he keeps accidentally doing good. Right? This was also moral luck. He didn't voluntarily choose those actions, and yet his actions through circumstances beyond his control did good, and he gets moral credit for that, even though there was luck involved. So again, that was a complicated point. Just to summarize, we need to think about these complicated cases that are between total free will and complete responsibility on the one hand, and totally being determined by circumstances, unable to act freely and hence not responsible on the other hand. We need to think about the complicated cases where we are partially controlled by our circumstances and partially just subject to good or bad luck. And yet within that, we have to be willing to take responsibility for how we act and be accountable for how we act, and recognize that partial conditioning and luck do not end our moral responsibility. Okay, so that's the third theme. And the last point takes us to what I think is the fourth and last major theme here. I kept saying we have to be willing to take responsibility, we have to be willing to be held to account, but that didn't answer a really important and difficult philosophical question, namely, what does that mean? What is it to take responsibility for what you do? What is it to be accountable for what you do? If you do harm and you can undo the harm, then great. Then taking responsibility is easy, right? If you do harm, even if you weren't fully choosing freely to do so, then taking responsibility is a matter of undoing the harm that you did. And that's how you take responsibility. But what about when you can't undo the harm? There are many, many times, particularly in this season, when harm can't be undone. And if you can't undo the harm that you did, then how do you properly take responsibility for it? How do you be held accountable for it? We've talked a lot about apology, right? But one of the things we've seen is that merely apologizing does not automatically satisfy this requirement of taking responsibility and holding yourself accountable. And here in season 5, we see just how cheap apology can be and how little it can do. Remember Vance's apology tour, right? He does all these horrifically harmful things, abusive, harmful things. And then he walks around on TV shows saying he's sorry. This is apology as mere public performance. We talked about this way back in season 1. So apology as mere public performance of this sort is not really any interesting kind of taking responsibility, especially since he goes right back to the bad behavior all over again. But there's an interesting question that we've looked at before, namely, if you give a good apology, how does that good apology help, right? If it doesn't undo the harm, what kind of moral act is a good apology? How does that help in terms of accountability? Also, how do you take accountability yourself? Right? We have a better sense of what it is for other people to hold us accountable for our actions by praising us or punishing us or blaming us than we do have an idea of what it is to hold ourselves accountable. Right? So when Bojack realizes that he's done this horrifically terrible thing to Gina, he wants others to hold him accountable. Right? He wants other people, he's willing to be accountable in a way, which is great, but he wants still to put the responsibility on other people to hold him accountable. And Diane points out they're not going to do that, right? They're not going to hold him accountable, and it's not even clear what it means in this case for others to hold him accountable. He has to figure out how to hold himself accountable. So if he can't undo the harm, that's one option that isn't open. If he can't effectively apologize, that's another option that isn't open. If other people aren't going to punish him or hold him accountable, then that's closed down. So how can he hold himself accountable? Another thing that's not going to do it, which comes up often, is just feeling bad and guilty on the inside doesn't help anything either, right? This is, remember, Todd told him this a couple seasons ago. You can't just keep doing bad things and then feeling crappy about them and think that that fixes it because you feel guilty. We get lots of reminders of that what's on the inside doesn't help. So that's another route that doesn't help. He can't hold himself accountable just by feeling bad or feeling guilty. So what can he do, right? Again, to recap, he can't undo the harm. He can't effectively apologize. Other people aren't going to hold him accountable. And feeling bad isn't enough. So what would holding himself accountable and taking responsibility for what he's done mean here? I think that season 5 leaves us at the end without a clear answer to that, but it's a philosophical question that we're supposed to think about carefully. So those are my 4 themes. A couple of other quick points to keep your eye on this season before I close this lecture. One is a note of deep irony. Remember, this is a great example of moral luck. I was just talking about moral luck. One of the best examples of moral luck in this season is Bojack becoming an accidental feminist hero without meaning to, just because at the right moment and in the right forum, he says, don't choke women. Choking women is bad, which should be just an obvious thing to say, but it gets taken up as this sort of banner of feminism, and he turns into this feminist hero. But that's a deeply ironic moment given what he does to Gina at the end of the season, right? So he becomes famous as a moral hero specifically for saying, don't choke women. And then his moral downfall is specifically him choking a woman. And importantly, neither of these are things he did on purpose, right? So this is another lesson in how your inner intentions just don't matter that much on this show. because it's an existentialist show. Like all existentialists, the show's stance is that the inner life doesn't matter that much, right? He didn't mean to be making a big feminist statement when he said don't choke women. He didn't mean to become a feminist icon. And likewise, he doesn't mean to choke her at the end. But in some sense, both of those acts, even though he didn't intend them, and even though they were a matter of moral luck, are still morally important facts that he's responsible for. So that's the first point. The second and last point that I want to make before closing is about origin stories. So at this point in the show, Diane and Princess Carolyn and Bojack and Mr. Peanut Butter all have a dedicated episode where they travel to the place of their family origin, specifically to try to find some sense of self through finding continuity to place, right? They want to ground themselves by seeing themselves as connected to and making sense in light of the place where their ancestors were from. And in each of these 4 cases, the trip turns out to be disappointing and alienating, and they learn that they can't do that. So in season 5, Diane goes to Vietnam, and she is hoping to find some sense of origins or continuity, but she experiences it as a totally foreign and alien place where she ends up pretending to be somebody totally fake. Last season, we saw that Bojack goes back to the old Sugarman place to try to find himself and his family origins, and he ends up abandoning that self and going back to LA and destroying what he's done. Mr. Peanut Butter goes back to Labrador, which is very much what he thinks of as his homeland, and he thinks of himself as deeply connected to his family, but as soon as his brother tries to have a serious conversation, he can't handle it, and we learn that he can't actually be deeply connected to anyone there. He can roughhouse and joke around and have fun and be shallow, but when he is confronted with the need for real connection there, it freaks him out and he runs away. And finally, in this season, Princess Caroline goes back to North Carolina to try to adopt a baby. She goes back to the town she's from. But when she's there, she's constantly on the phone to Los Angeles. And she's never actually in the place she's in. She's always got one foot away from where she is, and she comes off to the people in her hometown, not as somebody who is from there, but quite the opposite, as very much this LA person who has flown in from LA, hasn't really left LA behind, has LA on the phone all the time, and Sadie accuses her of being manipulative and deceitful and a poser, right? Sadie doesn't take her as being really from there at all. So what do we learn from these 4 episodes? One thing we learn is that our ties to a place ancestrally might be important to us, but they're not going to give us any easy answer to the question of who we are and what we should do and who we should be. Diane says this explicitly towards the end of the Vietnam episode. She says, you go back and you think you might find a connection to something bigger, but you don't. So this is a kind of a nihilist answer here. Our origin stories might be important to us. They might help shape us, but they are not, in fact, us. We are not the places our family came from, and that kind of historical connection is not going to give us easy answers to our existential questions. Notice, by the way, that when we see Princess Carolyn's mom begging her to stay in North Carolina before she leaves for university, it's literally the dilemma from Sartre that I had you read. Remember, Sartre explains radical freedom by looking at a young man's choice between staying to help his mom, who is dependent on him and begs him to stay, versus going off into the world. And his point is, Sartre's point is, that you need to recognize that ultimately no one has a claim over you and no place has a claim over you. Whichever choice you make, both choices are reasonable, but it's your choice. It's not a choice that you can pawn off on anyone else. So if Princess Carolyn had stayed, Sartre would say, that would not be her mom's doing. That would be her own choice that she needs to own. That's just kind of a side note because the reference back to Sartre's dilemma is obviously intentional there in the show. But really the point that I want to make here is Diane's point, that when you go back to your place of origin, you think you might find a connection to something bigger, but you don't, or at least that's what the show tells us.